So, good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining. My name is Samuel Ndebele, and today's webinar is on workforce planning in Anaplan. So, if we start at the beginning, what is workforce planning? So, as defined by the CIPD, workforce planning is made up of four key areas. The first being a process of analysing the current workforce, that current state analysis, your as-is model, if you like. Determining future workforce needs, so looking at the requirements and requisitions that will be in place for the future, that target goal, if you like, the strategic planning, and then of course identifying the gap between where you are now in that current workforce and the needs that you're going to have in the future. Finally, it's implementing solutions so that an organization can accomplish its mission, goals, and strategic plan. And of course, Anaplan comes in not just in helping you to analyze the current workforce and identify those future goals, but largely in terms of implementing that solution, providing that solution through which you would be able to achieve those goals. How does workforce planning fit into the bigger picture within an organization? Now, anyone that has seen an Anaplan presentation beforehand will understand that we have this use case agnostic, function agnostic approach through the Anaplan platform. What that basically means is that Anaplan can provide solutions to a variety of requirements across your organization. And with this honeycomb diagram that you'll probably have seen before, what it's showing us is that the orange area, the orange honeycombs are relating to HR. And here we're looking specifically at typical use cases in HR, so talent strategy, workforce planning, compensation modeling. But the way that they fit into that big picture is really key. So if we take, for example, the green honeycombs and we look at the finance use cases that we have here, and specifically if we look at our income statement forecasting, in that we're going to be forecasting OPEX. And from that OPEX forecast, we're going to be looking at employee costs, salaries, benefits, and so on. Employee costs are often a key driver of operational expenditure, and as a result, we may want to go into more detail or more granularity on the key drivers within employee forecasting or employee cost forecasting. And this is the section where we may now have a segue from finance, where we're looking at employees as a cost, to HR, where we're now looking at hiring, we're looking at talent strategy, that workforce planning that we're focusing on here, compensation modeling, and so on. This can then go further across into sales, where we're in our sales forecasting and quota modeling and so on, territory planning. We may then want to consider incentives and rewards. So now we'd be looking at commission structures, bonus structures, incentive compensation management, and the way that that too may feed into that HR piece, which then would feed into your finance piece. All, of course, potentially rolling up into your employee costs or your sales forecasting. So as an overview, workforce planning, because of course it is centered around people, links to pretty much every single function within an organization. And this is why Anaplan is such a good solution, because Anaplan enables you to plan across all functions in an organization. So let's look a little bit more at the Anaplan solution, the Anaplan workforce planning solution. The 5 key sections to the solution that we identify are, firstly, driver-based workforce planning. So in that, we can analyze your current workforce key metrics and set compensation drivers. So just like in finance, where we would have driver-based planning, we'll be looking at our key drivers, we'll be able to do exactly the same thing from a workforce planning element. in that we'd be able to run what-if scenarios for headcount and compensation, or FTE and compensation. We'd be able to do this across the business based on any dimensionality that you would like to work with. Secondly, we've got workforce demand by line of business. Now, the line of business really refers to the groupings that we looked at beforehand in the honeycomb, where we were looking at our finance, we may be looking at HR, we may be looking at marketing, we may be looking at sales, and so on. Each of these lines of business will have an interaction with HR because of the employees being typically central to each of these functions. And Anaplan enables us to use metrics specific to each role to determine hiring demand and submit requisitions of new headcount for approval, all within the system, all potentially within one model that you can then access or grant access to the various users as required. Evaluating internal workforce supply. Anaplan enables you to leverage statistical algorithms, inbuilt algorithms based on functions and formulas that we have in the system at our disposal to better predict attrition. Not just attrition, we can of course predict any kind of trend or correlation that we may want to forecast in the system. And in the same way that we may do in terms of sales demand, in terms of capacity planning, revenue planning, this would apply as well, of course, to workforce planning. And we can use any kind of history that we have, any historical data from which we can draw a correlation or trend. We can use that to produce to populate a forecast. And in this case, it would be to better predict attrition in relation to workforce planning. In addition, we can create internal candidate evaluations to drive upward mobility as well. And the final two here, workflow and approvals for new headcount. So we'll look at this in a moment in the product, but having the control centrally to approve or reject the requests for heads within teams. So centrally, from a top-down perspective, you can give that control, that ownership to your business, and the business can then request the heads that they need based on the demand that they see coming. And of course, you can then have that central senior control whereby you'd be able to approve or reject those requests, therefore determining whether those numbers would flow through the model and ultimately hit the P&L and otherwise. So you can track and approve requested headcount and FTEs, and you can account for potential unpaid leave in the workforce capacity. Finally, tracking hiring of requested headcount. So here it could be as simple as cost center moves, people moving from one section of the business to another, from one company within a group to another, changing locations and changing currencies, and so on and so forth. Even allocating employees across multiple cost centers. All of this is very doable in Anaplan in a very easy and transparent way, where historically, of course, that has been a real challenge to manage in Anaplan. It's a nice, simple process. And that's candidate tracking down to each requisition with real-time updates to headcount reports once candidates accept the offer, or of course, once a requisition has been approved within a specific workflow. For more information, you can visit the Bedford Consulting website at www.bedfordconsulting.co.uk, where there'll be a recording of this webinar. Alternatively, you can send us an email at info@bedfordconsulting.com. So I'll now jump into the product and show you Anaplan. In our honeycomb, we looked at how the different functions, how the different use cases come together. And of course, the focus here is workforce planning. And in that, I want to start off here from this view that we have in an FP&A model, because it's a nice journey to see the end before we sort of work down to the more granular detail that we have in the system. Here we're looking at a reporting summary in the FP&A application. And in this FP&A application, we can see that we have summaries of the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow reports. Now, from this view, we can see that the focus here is budget, And in that, we're able to look through the various dimensions that we have, the lists that we're using, and we can see here that we could look by countries. We could look at United Kingdom. We may want to look at France. We may want to look at Germany, or of course, we could look through North America or Asia or any of the locations that we have. And all of the reports, all of the statements will update within this report so that we can see that information. Similarly, we may want to look at a more consolidated view. We may say, well, actually, let's look at Europe and all of the countries that roll up into Europe, we'll be able to see that information. In that, if we focus on the United Kingdom, we can then see that for Q1 of the budget 21 that we're currently populating, we have this total OPEX number. And within that total OPEX number, of course, we can drill that down so that that quarterly number of 5442638 is then broken down monthly. And we can drill that down further so that we can now see the contribution of salary and benefits in that OPEX number. Now, this is really key because this 510,000 for January is, of course, going even further down in terms of granularity so that we can now look at that by employee. And in doing so, we would want to plan at that lowest level, whether it be cost center, whether it be in specific currencies, specific to sections of the business. That's the level that we'd want to be planning at, all the while being able to look at it from this summarized view, from this aggregated view, so that we can see a more holistic total company perspective. So when we want to drill this down into more detail, we can look at our bottom-up budgeting approach, and in that we can come through to our workforce planning. And from our workforce planning, we're then able to look for United Kingdom, and now we can start to look at the specific employees that roll up into United Kingdom. And again, UK is probably quite a high level to view this, so we may want to allocate control here to the specific managers of the specific sections. So here we would say, for example, if we just look at London, we can see that we've got London finance, IT, marketing, and so on. For Manchester, we have a similar breakdown. And then within France, we have Paris with a similar breakdown, and so on. So ultimately, we're looking at each of those functions in finance, IT, marketing, HR, and legal across each of the locations that we have. And if I were to take London, I can then see everyone that rolls up into London. And if I take that down a level, I can actually look at London finance. And now I can see everybody who rolls up into London finance. And of course, we can set any kind of access that we would want so that certain people can see certain areas in relation to that list, so that when they access this, instead of being able to choose between all of the items that we have here, they will only see the sections of this that are relevant to them. In Anaplan, we call this selective access, and it applies to all of the lists that we have. So for any information you see here, you can control exactly the way that users interact with that information. From this view, we can see in London Finance that we have Mitchell Foster through to Susie Waters. And we can then see, if we click on any one of these people, we can see the employee expenses that are relevant to that person. So we can see the salary that they're receiving by quarter. We can see any bonus that may be in place. We can see any commission, and then the total salary cost. If there's any retirement, social security, health insurance, or any other benefits that are relevant, and of course, then the total compensation. And that total compensation is then flowing through to that P&L OPEX line that we looked at a moment ago. For each of the people that we have in this list, we're then able to go right down to the kind of role that they're doing, so we can choose the role that they have. And for the role that we choose, we would see the base salary changing. You'll have noticed that the payroll GL breakdown updated as I made a change here. Everything in Anaplan changes in real time. So for any changes that I'm making here at this lower level in terms of the payroll data, that's flowing through to the P&L in real time. So you can be viewing that P&L on your mobile phone, tablet, or laptop, and you can know that the information that you're seeing is updated and it's in real time based on the changes that are being made at the most granular level, whether that be by a user or whether it be imported from a source system. So if the new role is mid-level, then it would change that base salary to 100,000. If, however, we had that new role, if we had that role as it was before, then of course it would change the base salary accordingly. And the reason is because we have assumptions in the background that are, of course, driving these roles and the salaries that relate to them. And the reason why this is key is because in this example, we're saying that the employee role is going to be the driver of salary. But of course, employee role in Anaplan is just a list, and that list could be grade. So you may say, well, actually, we want to base our salaries on grade, or we want to base our salary on experience, or we want to base our salary on whatever it may be, location or otherwise. All of those assumptions, of course, you can build into the system as you wish. With that, we can input any additional information, whether it be a start date, an end date, whether they be a contractor or not. Of course, all of these are approved, which means that for anyone that we click on, we're seeing that information flow through. If we wanted to override any of this information, we'd be able to do so as well. So I may decide that as the manager of London Finance, instead of 120, I would like this to be 130. And in doing so, what you'll notice is that Mitchell Foster is now no longer pulling through the employee expenses and no longer pulling through to the P&L. The reason for this is because 120,000 has been approved for the product specialist 2, 130,000 hasn't been. And this is where we start to see that approval process so that we can have a central control while also giving managers or business function owners, giving them the accountability and responsibility to own their section. So for London Finance as my area, I can add in a change that I request, but of course it won't be until that gets approved up the chain that I would be able to see that information come through. So now my manager will be able to come in and have a look from this view, and we can see the start date, we can see the role, we can see the person, we can see it's in relation to London Finance and it's the budget for FY21. And I can either approve or reject this based on the fact that the banding is 120, but 130 has been requested. And if I think that's okay, I can of course tick that. And in doing so, we would then see that Mitchell Foster has now been updated in real time. That is now flowing through as per before, only that now, of course, we're seeing that 130,000 as opposed to the 120,000. There's a 5% pay rise that's been calculated. We can see the total salary that will be coming through. And of course, we can input any additional information, such as the pension, with different assumptions on the pension that we may have, and the FTE that the person will have. And if there are any columns that you would want in here that you don't see at the moment, or if there are any columns that you see that wouldn't be relevant to you, of course, in typical Anaplan fashion, this is fully customizable. So you'd be able to make any of the changes that you wanted to make so that you could customize this to your requirements specifically. And for everything that we're putting in here at this lowest level, of course, we can see the gap to target. So we can see that actually we have an adverse gap to our top-down target here by 0.35 million. We can see the total OPEX number as well, so that when we now start to look at this from a more high-level cost center view, as a cost center summary, we can then start to see that we have this 353,000 adverse variance that we would need to address. Maybe there have been too many pay rises in there, and we can then make adjustments accordingly. So in terms of how it fits into the big picture, we can see that here, how it's fitting into that big picture, and the view that we may have in Anaplan when we want to look at that bigger picture, but also, of course, having the option to drill down into more granular detail so that we can look at the employee costs, which is a key focus here, of course, for workforce planning. Now, as previously mentioned, with workforce planning, it applies to so many functions, if not every function, as every function in some way, shape, or form is going to have employees in most cases. The focus here is very much from a financial aspect. And in finance, we're very much viewing those employees as costs, whether it be OPEX, whether it be CAPEX. Ultimately, it's going to be an expenditure of some sort. Now, on the revenue side, granted, we may be looking at incentive compensation. But from an HR perspective, we would typically be looking at employees from with much more breadth in terms of perspective. There would be the cost element in terms of salary and so on, and packages and what have you. But in addition to that, we may be wanting to look at diversity. We may be wanting to look at some other metrics, qualitative metrics that may be of importance to us from an HR perspective. And here in this workforce planning app that is focused more from an HR perspective than a finance perspective, what we're able to do is show how Anaplan can be utilized from both perspectives, from both views. So here we're looking at a top level headcount report. And in this, we're breaking it down by department. And we can see that we have our sales, our services, our marketing, our operations, our corporate and executive, all rolling up into all departments. And of course, we can choose some of these specifically from the drop down if we wanted to. We can choose different locations, so we can choose across the different geographies that we have. And we can choose any specific information that might be relevant to us that we'd want to pull out. And here we can see that breakdown geographically. Now in this report, what it's focusing on is the current year headcount through to the future year headcount. And it's giving us a walk of how we get there in terms of those who have been transferred out, those that have been transferred in, expected attrition, approved requisitions. So we've seen already how we may want to manage that approval process from a finance perspective. But here we're looking at this more from a headcount FTE perspective. We can then look at the expenses that are pulling through, and it may well be that this line here would actually be pulling through from that finance application that we just looked at. We've got an expense breakout percentage, so we can look at any kind of weighting, and we can look at where we're incurring more or less expenses, so we can have our key areas of focus, any overrides that we require in terms of the budgets, and then of course a reference to the top down as well as the bottom up, so that we can always look at that comparison with a variance, so that we can see where we are in terms of our top down targets for each of the departments that we have. But then where it goes a step further is in enabling us to start to look at this by different groups of data, dimensions as we would call them in Anaplan. We have our average salary by age band. So granted, very big age bands here, but to show the point, we can then look at the average salary, the last 30 hires as an average, and then of course we can see how that fits, and we can see that visually as well as a breakdown, so that we can start to see how the salaries relate to those age bands. We may want to look at that by gender. So looking at a breakdown of male and female and the salaries that we have, addressing topics like, for example, a gender pay gap and so on, being able to have that information to hand simply by pulling it in from a source system that's already holding that data, but maybe not giving you an opportunity to utilize that data. Anaplan would, of course, give you that opportunity to do that. And we could also break that down by ethnicity. So here we can see the ethnicity breakdowns, and of course the salaries and those average hires that we have as well. So we'll be able to go through each of these and pull out all of the information that was relevant to us, so that we could have a better understanding of our workforce, especially in relation to that current state planning that we were looking at as a first stage when we saw the slide earlier on. In addition to this, we'd be wanting to drill down into slightly more detail, slightly more information in terms of our headcount reporting. And from that high level view that we looked at just a moment ago by department, we may now want to become more specific in terms of looking at exactly where those movements are and getting more information from that. And in Anaplan, the level of granularity to which we go is a choice. So we can choose whether we want to look at that aggregated view, as we did, for example, in our summary report, in our P&L balance sheet and cash flow before, or of course, if we wanted to go into more detail and break that right down to the employee and their specific package and their specific functions and requirements and so on. Additionally, we may want to look at incentive compensation management. And in doing so, we'd now be looking at the workforce planning perspective, but we'd be doing so from the perspective of sales. So it'd be part of our sales planning. And if I just open this application here, we'll be able to see how this may look now from that aspect as a sales director or an operations director, now looking at the incentive compensation piece that might then again pull into our finance planning. So here we can see that we have that breakdown, and we can see we have our sales reps, our sales leadership, sales ops, for example. And if we go through to our sales reps, we can now see the kind of report that we might want to utilize, so that the rep themselves can now come in and keep track of their process. So here we'll probably link this to a source system such as a CRM, for example, Salesforce. Seamless integration with Salesforce would mean that we can pull through that pipeline. We could weight that pipeline and then, of course, see how that's going to look in terms of the current payment schedules or agreements that are in place around commission and otherwise. So if I'm coming through now as Tom Fraser, I can see my pay, I can see my month to date, quarter to date, and year to date. I can see my performance, and I can look at that visually on a chart, as well as seeing that broken down in any more detail that I might require so that I can see that as well. This, of course, from the perspective of a sales rep, but from a sales leadership perspective, I'll be able to look at it in a similar way. The key difference being that now, because we'll be looking at that team management piece, I'll be focusing on other sections such as attainment, Q to date bonus, and monthly payout. But in addition, I'll be looking at, for example, disputes. So if there are any territory disputes that may be occurring within my team or anything like that that I may want to manage, I'll be able to do so within Anaplan. Again, as a leader, I'll be looking at my team details, my team rankings, and I'll now be able to maybe rank the team based on my quarter to date attainment or otherwise. And from that, of course, I can start to arrange or better predict my planning in terms of how I want to allocate accounts or manage my territory and quota planning as I move forward. So I think in summary, the key thing here is that workforce planning is, of course, a very broad field because it's focused around people. And people are integral to pretty much every organization, spreading across pretty much every function within the organization. And therefore, the challenge and the consideration is how do you link all of these different requirements that relate to people, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, how do we link those across the organization in one platform? And that, of course, is the solution that Anaplan provides. Being able to approach the challenges that you face within your specific function, but with a holistic view that integrates every aspect of that organization in one platform is where Anaplan separates itself as a unique solution. And hopefully we've seen that in today's demo. And as previously mentioned, there'll be a recording available on the website. And for any more information, do feel free to email us as well. So thanks for your time today. Stay safe, and I look forward to hearing from you. Bye.